What a joy and privilege it is to be here with each of you this evening. And I want to thank all of you for coming. I know everybody has so many busy schedules, but I do appreciate it. And just want to say again on our behalf and the Institute for Hebraic Christian Studies, how honored we are to be able to have such an event. And again, Rabbi David Rosen, thank you so much for opening Congregation Beth Yeshurum to us. It's my joy and my privilege to introduce to you this evening our speaker, Al Marks. Richard and I had the pleasure of meeting he and Sarah a month or two back, and just enjoyed meeting and visiting with them so much. I'm not going to take the time to say very much about him because he's going to be telling you his story. One thing he did ask, and I know that you would understand without me even having to say so, and I've often thought of this each time as each of our survivors has taken the time to tell their story, how it opens up something that's still very much a part of them. And Al just said, if you would please bear with him, because as he tells his story, he can become very emotional, and he hopes you will understand. And I know that you would. Before he comes, I would like to ask Sarah if she would stand. This is his wife of 50 years. And I believe you have a daughter. If there's other family, if you would stand also to be recognized. Thank you for coming. And again, I present to you this evening our speaker, Al Marks. Hug you before.
I'm deeply touched. It's a real privilege to be here. A few years ago, I received a telephone call from the Texas City High School, and a wonderful lady by the name of Miss Holm was teaching the Holocaust to her students. And she was teaching it with a passion and with dedication second to none. And she asked me if I would go down and talk to her students. Needless to say, I said, yes, I'd be happy to, but I need you to do me a favor. Stand by me because I may need you. If I get too emotional, I hand you something to read until I get back to norm. And for the next 4 years, Miss Holmes stood there, and a few times I used her. One reason it didn't take me long to say yes to her, because a few years prior to that, I attended a Holocaust lecture. Why would a Holocaust survivor want to go to a lecture? Because I had a colleague, a very prominent local musician, who was a good friend and a very nice man, but he just did not believe in the Holocaust. And he continuously tried to get me talk about it. And finally, one day I said, do me a favor, just one small favor. I am asked to attend a lecture by a delightful speaker. Would you go with me? And finally, he decided he would. And the evening came, and I went, but my dear friend didn't show. And later, he didn't even bother to tell me why he didn't show. But I stayed there. And I'm glad I stayed, because that lecture left me with a lasting impression. And I thought, what could be more appropriate that I would start tonight the way the speaker, and I'm going to call him the professor, because he was the professor of a great college. I'm going to start the way he finished. He came to this country after the war, after the concentration camp. He finished his education, and he became a very prominent professor in a college. And this particular year, the college selected him to represent the school in Germany and give lecture in science, his field. And one day, on the way to his lecture, he had to change trains, transfer from one train to another train, and he got off in a medium-sized German town, beautiful sunny day, and came the announcement, the connecting train gonna be an hour late because of mechanical difficulties. And he welcomed that delay. It gave him a chance to go over to that coffee shop and have a cup of coffee and look over his notes. And he grabbed the last table because being the train late, everybody sat down. When he noticed a well-dressed gentleman, distinguished looking, with a cane, looking for a place to sit. And the professor, being a gentleman he was, asked him to join him. And the gentleman graciously accepted it, sat down, and they got involved in a beautiful, highly intellectual conversation. It's almost like two old friends meet after years. But all good things must come to an end, and the announcement came that in a few minutes, after a freight train gonna pull through the station, that train gonna come. And they got up, and they paid for their coffee, and started to walk toward the track when a freight train came through. The freight train with all the cattle cars. And the professor noticed that his friend's face expression totally changed. And after a few minutes, he looked at the professor and he said, "My dear friend, do you see that train?" He says, "Yes." He says, "These are the kind of wagons I accompanied to take the Jews to the gas chamber." And for a minute, the professor was speechless. And then he looked at him and he says, "Yes, I recognize that train. You see, the train you escorted, I was in one of these wagons as a passenger." And then the professor, who was standing at the podium, looked at us and he said, we looked at each other, and he looked at me and he knew who I was. And I looked at him and I knew who he was. And without saying another word, he left the podium. That sentence left me with a lasting impression. And when Dr. Booker called me and gave me the honor to be tonight, I said, yeah, this is the way I want to start. We got to remember not to forget. Got to remember not to forget. I'm not going to waste too much time talk about World War I because this is history you all know of. In 1933, you know, Adolf Hitler came to power. And one of Hitler's favorite slogans was, the Jews had all the money. And that was very hard for me to understand because at that time I was a kid in Budapest, Hungary. And we lived in a very poor subdivision, the 7th district. It was so rough and so poor that they actually called that subdivision Chicago. Really. And then when I heard that the Hitler said the Jews had all the money. See, my father was a porter at the East Station in Budapest. And we worked for $3 a day carrying the luggages for the well-to-do people who came in on the Orient Express every day at 12 o'clock. Yeah, he was the rich Jew. Hitler evidently didn't know the Walton family either. He probably would have had a totally different story. Us Hungarian Jews were so much luckier for a while than our brothers in Poland and every place else. History still talk about, and they did not come to a judgment, but allegedly our Chancellor, Admiral Horthy, was trying to save the Jews. He partially succeeded for a while, because at the very beginning, all the Jews were taken from the countryside, outside the city limit. But the people in the city were put in ghettos, and later on, because of the Swedish diplomat Wallenberg, many of them were saved. But sadly, we lived at that time outside the city limit, and one early morning, the posse, the local sheriff, came by and said, "Get your toothbrush and close the door, you'll be back later." He knew very well that we will not be back, but we didn't know it. And then came the trip to Auschwitz. And the doors opened up early in the morning, and the big searchlights. We had no idea where we were or why we were there. And there was the SS officer. I found out later was Dr. Mengele. Dr. Mengele was a medical doctor who went to medical school to learn how to save lives. What he practiced in his medicine, how to send people to the gas chamber. My biggest heartbreak, that I never had a chance to even kiss and hug my parents before they were sent to the other side. We were in Birkenau 2-3 days. Again, the freight train. And then we went to a place called Mauthausen. Now these camps I am mentioning, they were all labor camps. They were not as notorious, and very few people sometimes even heard about them, like Dachau or Bergen-Belsen or those places. But the people who were sent there, they were sent there to work until they die. The German men at that time were fighting, and they needed the slave labor to do the job we were doing. From Mauthausen, they sent us to a place called Melk. Melk is where I spent the longest period. What we were doing in Melk is building a tunnel. The tunnel was designed, it was designed to put in the rocket, the secret weapon to win the war. Thank the Lord that Werner von Braun didn't finish the job. It was brutal work, and there was no way out. And I've been asked many times, you were only in a camp for a year. And my answer is very simple. In any concentration camp, one day is like being on a death row in Huntsville, because we were told daily that no one will ever leave the camp alive. On July 8, 1944, Melk was bombed by the American Air Force on the way to Vienna by mistake. Evidently, our intelligence wasn't as good that time as it is now. Quote. We were bombed, and in less than 2 minutes, until the Air Force found out it was a mistake, we lost 600 people. I had a little blood on my chest. Who would pay attention to a little blood on your chest when you had arms and legs around you? And I didn't know till after the war, when an X-ray technician screamed, "You have a hole in your lung," that it wasn't a hole, but a piece of a bomb, which I still carry. The two most brutal things I can remember in Melk, and this is quite graphic, that we had to watch executions. And this is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. 2 prisoners tried to escape. and they were executed, and we had to watch it. Allegedly, 2 Polish prisoners escaped from Auschwitz, and one of them ended up in the Vatican. And they found deaf ears to their plea, "Help us." Strangely, at that time, most of the inmates in the concentration camps weren't even Jews. You know, at the very beginning, they were the Jehovah's Witnesses, they were the political prisoners, they were the gypsies, they were the gays. The Jews came later. And a little later, when I want to give you some ammunition what to say if people talk to you about a Holocaust. But anyway, the end of April, or the middle of April in 1945, the Russians were coming from the east, and they put us on barges, and they sent us to a town called Linz, and from Linz to Ebensee, that was a death march. 3 days walking, and whoever could not walk, they were shot by the roadside. We arrived to Ebensee, and there was the big gate, and it said in German, "Arbeit macht frei." Work liberates you. In reality, work there killed you, because there was no anticipated liberation. We got to Ebensee, and we found 14,000 skeletons, ghosts. The bodies were lined up because the crematory couldn't bury them. The smell was horrible. There was no more work in the tunnel because there was a total chaos. And then a day before liberation, the German commandant assembled us. And he gave a speech. And he said, "The American army is nearby, and we're going to fight them back, but we want to be sure we save you. So we need everybody to go into the tunnel." And the camp elders said no, because they knew that the tunnel means instant death. And we found out, yes, they had a truck parked by the opening with all the ammunition to blow up the beginning of the tunnel. So we refused because we felt that they may not have even enough time, enough ammunition to finish us up. And that night, we looked out, and the other side of the barbed wire, we saw civilian guards. And that was the first ray of hope. But we still weren't sure, because we thought, what if they went after to get some reinforcement to finish us up? We couldn't close our eyes that night. What's going to happen tomorrow? And there comes the part when I probably have to take out my handkerchief. Because next morning at about 11 o'clock, a tank came through the door to the gate. The tank was driven by an angel on earth by the name of Bob Persinger and his colleague. And he was followed by 5 jeeps. And that was the liberation. And people ask me so many times, could you describe how it felt to be liberated? Dear friends, there are no words in the English language or in any language we could tell you the feeling. There are just no words. So, sadly, so many people died after liberation because their body couldn't handle the food. Just recently, you may watch TV about this magician somewhere in England who started for 40 days and he was told, you can't eat because you're going to die. That's what happened to so many of my dear friends. I stayed in a camp 2-3 weeks, and then I got on a freight train and I went home to find my family. It didn't take me long to find out that they were not there. I came back, stayed in a displaced person camp, and after applying for my papers, I had a glorious day arriving to New York in November 1947. I was fortunate, and I asked the committee who helped me to come to this country if they could send me any place else but the big city of New York. And thank God, I ended up in Houston. I never heard of Houston before. In 1952, during the Korean conflict, I was drafted. I served 2 years. I came out as Corporal L. Marks, and later on the governor of Kentucky made me Colonel L. Marks, which I never used. One of the most glorious days was after I came back. Bear with me. To marry my high school sweetheart, who's as beautiful today as she was 50 years ago. But I had one dream all these years, and nothing was more important. I must admit to you, because of my profession, I was exposed to some very exciting days in my music business. Played the Apollo 17 astronauts when they came back to the moon, played for the president, things like that. But the most exciting day was I wanted to find my liberators. And one afternoon, about 10 years ago, I got on the computer. And I hate computers. I really do. I feel as the worst thing ever happened to us, except it did one thing for me. I put in Ebensee, and a picture came up of the camp with 30-some prisoners after liberation. And way back in the very back row, I looked at myself, and there was a name, Ernie Seibel, Lieutenant, and a telephone number. And before I turned the computer off, I went to the phone, and I made the longest and most expensive long-distance phone call I ever made, because Ernie and I were on the phone for 2 hours. And Ernie said, next month we have our yearly meeting, and Bob Persinger will be there. And he said, would you come? And I said, Ernie, I would be there if I would have to walk to Detroit. I didn't have to walk. We flew up. And I remember the line a while ago when the professor said, I looked at him and he looked at me, and he knew who I was and I knew who he was. And when I walked into that hotel in Detroit, loaded with people in the lobby, there was a tall man standing, waiting for me. That was Bob Persinger, the man who liberated me. And two grown men with tears in their eyes were hugging, and then spent the rest of the day talking, looking at pictures. That's how I found my liberators. So, when I listened to Dr. Booker, he said something very unique. He says we got to focus now on some good things. So before I finish with a beautiful human story, let me just share with you a couple of my ideas how we can maybe avoid a future Holocaust. Dear Christian brothers who are here, you must remember one thing. The last Holocaust started with Christians and ended up with Jews. It is my firm belief, and like I said, it is my belief and not an official from anyone else. It is my firm belief, if once again a Holocaust would happen, it would start with the Jews, but it would not end up with the Jews. Because after Jews, somebody else have to be the scapegoat. So, the key word, what we have to remember, is involvement. We got to be involved. We got to talk to our kids. We got to make a point that our children would go to the Holocaust Museum. In your church, in your synagogue, in your service clubs like the Rotary, the Lions. Ask for a speaker sometimes. Miss Meyer said the Holocaust Museum would be delighted to send somebody out. If she doesn't have anybody, you can call me day or night. And whether it's 2 people or 2,000 people, we will be there and we talk to them. But now, I would like to end up with a truly tearjerker. A story which tells you there are miracles around us every day. Sarah and I were blessed with a handicapped child after 2 beautiful, talented girls. And how can you say blessed? How can somebody be blessed with a handicapped child? Well, the good Lord up there, and that goes addressed to all your ministers and the rabbi, the good Lord up there has some funny way to work things out. David, who was born with a mental deficiency, we never thought the day would come that we could enjoy him as much as we are enjoying him today. And we never knew that indirectly, someday, hundreds of hungry people, old people, gonna have a meal, and they're not gonna be hungry because of David. And my wonderful friend, Joe Samuels, who's sitting here, he knows that story. He knows what I'm referring to. But anyway, at that time, when this episode took place, the sky was black. And David was in a children's ward in the Austin State Hospital. He had tremendous psychological problems. And we had a chance to see him once a month for 15 minutes. And this particular month, it was December, just before Christmas, we had a phone call. And we were told that we can only see him for 3 minutes. They had some problems at the unit, and the children can only be seen at 11 o'clock for 3 minutes, and if you're not there at 11 o'clock, you won't see him. Now you may think that is insignificant, but for a child who knows who you are, and we were his life, I knew that we have to be there at 11 o'clock. I told Sarah we're going to leave at 6 o'clock to make the 5-hour trip to Austin, because it only takes 3 hours. Be sure we get there. It was raining, and after we passed the little town of Brookshire, if any of you ever drives to San Antonio, you know on the left-hand side is a park, a roadside park. And that's the only place where you turn to the left to the roadside park. And we had to stop. I couldn't keep my eyes open. I said, I close my eyes for 10 minutes, then we go. And we pulled down, and I closed my eyes. In 10 minutes, when I opened my eyes and I turned the key, and the car wouldn't start. And I had cars and people all around me. And I went begging, please help me, I have to get to Austin. And we found deaf ears. You know, just like the guy who went to Rome and found deaf ears. Nobody, all those new cars, the Cadillacs, the SUVs, whatever, they didn't respond. And I was in terror. I have to get to Austin. And then came the miracle. A car pulled up. I cannot even describe that car. It was like a garbage sedan. The door was tied to the frame with rope. The back seat was loaded with pots and pans and blankets and dirt. A little bearded old hobo type of man was sitting on the passenger side, and a little skinny lady was driving. And the little hobo looked at me, and he says, "Can I help you, son?" And when he called me son, I liked him immediately. And I said, "I don't know what you can do, but anything you can do will be appreciated." And he says, "Well, let me get out." It took him a couple of minutes to get out. See, after he got out, I realized he only had one leg. And he pulled his crutch, and he asked me to open the hood, and he informed me, "I'm sorry, I can't start you, but one thing I can do. If you don't mind to climb in the back, we'll find the station, somebody who would help you." And I went with him, and we probably passed 4 or 5 closed stations until we found one open. And on our way to the station, he mentioned that he is in a VA hospital and he's going home with his wife to see his children. I wanted to give him money. He wouldn't take it. And I told him, "You know, you want me to have a nice Christmas. And if you don't take this money, I won't have a nice Christmas." And finally, he took it. And the station helped me out. And I got in the car, and I broke every speeding record. And if there's any highway patrolman here, I hope you don't find me. And 3 minutes before 11 o'clock, we drove up to the children's ward, to a smiling and crying and happy David. And my wife, who sits there, she knows that story. Now, why did I share this story with you? What does it have to do with the Holocaust? One word, my dear friends, just one word. Involvement. That man got involved. And while all the others who sat there didn't even open the window, didn't ask me, what's wrong? He got involved. And today, if I could talk to him, I would tell him, "Nick," I call him Nick because it happened before Christmas. I would tell him, "Nick, you know, maybe you never had more than $20 in your pocket. And maybe you didn't build 7 castles in Colorado on a borrowed money from your employees. And maybe I would tell the little old lady, that dear lady, maybe you never been a TV diva, and maybe you never sold $500 million worth to Kmart. But you went home to your children who loved you and adored you." And my dear friends, this is what life is all about. And I thank you so much for allowing me to be with you.
Now, Al mentioned a gentleman several times by the name of Bob Persinger. Bob and his wife Arlene live in Illinois. And when Bob was a young tank commander at 20 years old in the 3rd Army F Company, on May 6, 1945, as Al has said, Bob was the first Liberator to drive his tank into Al's camp. And what Bob saw would make an impression on him forever. We're so excited that Bob and Arlene have taken time out of their schedule to come from Illinois to be with us tonight. Bob, would you come up here? Where are you, Bob? Now, Bob has a few words, too, he wants to share. So if you'd take a seat while they're greeting each other. Isn't this wonderful? Everything has to wait for hugs, you know. Hugs are the priority. Bob, you want to come up here with Al and just say a few words to the people on your impressions when you drove that tank? We were just with our tank command friends in Israel. If you would just come on up here, Al, if you would just say a few words.
Thank you. What an evening. Yes, I have an article here that I wrote this story in the history of our unit. A few years ago, we published a book, and it's called The 150-Year Saga of the 3rd Cavalry. And the war, you know, in Europe was nearing the end of May 6, 1945. And this is what I put in our book. There's a brief story. F Company, a tank company of the 3rd Cavalry, arrived in Ebensee, Austria, a beautiful, beautiful little village in the Alp Mountains with a beautiful lake. And we were told that there was a concentration camp nearby. And I was given the assignment to take my tank and another tank to the gates and enter the camp with our 2 tanks. We did so with no resistance. However, the sights were unbelievable. There were an estimated 14,000 prisoners within the camp. They were skeleton-like figures, weighing perhaps around 70 pounds. Many lay dead within their barracks and out on the grounds. The crematorium had piles of bodies waiting to be cremated. The stench of the rotting bodies was sickening and almost unbearable. The sight of these people being treated like this brought undescribable feelings within us and tears to our eyes as we saw what these people were enduring. It was obvious that they had to have some food. We started to collect from the surrounding area of Ebensee, and a soup was prepared and served the following day. It had been so long since they had eaten any nourishing food that their digestive system was unable to digest the food. Consequently, many became sick and died. Now the Army moved in with hospital units and we set up and we saved hundreds of lives and start them on the return to health. For us who saw this, Ebensee was something we would never forget as long as we live. That was my story in this book that we had published. And I was so glad to meet Al, as he said, in Detroit in 1998. And Al came back to our reunion in Louisville, Kentucky in 2000. What a wonderful man. He entertained us. He's such a musician. We just grew to love him. Thanks, Al. I get to see you once more.
Ladies and gentlemen, these are the real heroes in our country. I also should mention that Bob's colleague, Dick Pamanti.
Yes,
Dick was his teammate, and a few weeks before I met the group, he passed away. His wife was at the meeting, and I went up to her, and needless to say, I broke down. But at least I had a chance to tell her what her husband did for me. They are wonderful people. Please give them a big hand. What time?
Thank you, Bob and Al. We're going to have a wonderful shofar presentation of the Holocaust with our dear shofar minister, Randy Spencer. And we're going to slip down off the podium so we can see. And once we can get down, we'll dim the lights for the shofar presentation. After that, our dear friends from the Jewish and Christian communities come to light these candles with us, and we'll move right on with the program. So